Hello and welcome to everyone. We are so excited that you could all be here for today's webinar. My name is Mary Mall. I am the Graduate Assistant for the Zehr Institute and the Center for Justice and Peacebuilding. I will be going over our agenda as well as helping with this online platform. We will begin with our host Tarek introducing our guest speakers. After the presentation, there will be time for questions and answers, which will be moderated by our host. After the Q&A portion has concluded, I will share a few announcements related to the Zehr Institute and the Center for Justice and Peacebuilding. Then the webinar will be closed out with remarks provided by Tarek. We hope you are all able to stay until the end, but if you cannot, there will be a recording of this webinar posted on the Zehr Institute's website and YouTube channel by early next week, if you'd like to watch it again or share it with others. For today's webinar, comments and questions may be submitted through the comment section on the platform you are using. Our host will be facilitating the Q&A portion after the presentation. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the webinar. And now I'm going to pass to Tarek.
Welcome, everyone. It's my pleasure to cue us up today for a very important conversation about the need for LGBTIQA2S plus lens in restorative justice. I'm coming to you live from a couple blocks from Haight-Ashbury, the intersection in San Francisco. San Francisco has played a tremendous role in the history of the movement, and it's a fun coincidence to be here and able to host this from here today. I want to say a few things. First, I'd like to just remind us that restorative justice is very much about being seen and seeing others for who they are, where they're coming from, and working together in deciding where we're going. Gender and sexuality are a deep and important part of every individual and every community, and yet one that still is not fully accepted, seen, and understood. And so I think it's imperative, as the title suggests, that we start to think about restorative justice in terms of that lens itself. I want to offer a statement that was provided by the Restorative Rainbow Alliance to set us off on this topic. Our work as LGBTIQA2S plus restorative justice practitioners is intended to honor LGBTIQA2S plus people who are currently experiencing systemic and communal oppression and violence for living as their authentic selves. This includes those who live in countries where their very existence is considered illegal, those who have lost familial support, those who are branded as immoral, criminal, or sick, those who are struggling to find support, and those who have lost their lives to transphobia or homophobia. We honor those who have come before us in this work, and those who have worked diligently to create and sustain our LGBTIQA2S plus communities. In particular, we honor Black and Brown trans activists who have consistently been transformative leaders on the front lines of the movement. And yet we are continually denied the rewards of this activism while continuing to face persecution in all areas of society. Furthermore, we acknowledge Indigenous communities whose practices and ways of being have become the fruitful, nourishing roots of current restorative justice practices. We support the use of restorative justice practices to address the first and second harms, that is the theft of Indigenous land and enslavement of Africans, as Edward Valandra describes in Colorizing Restorative Justice. This includes acknowledgement by white settler RJ practitioners of these harms and the return of Indigenous lands. With that, I'd like to introduce who we've got up as guests on our webinar today. All three are the founding board members of the Restorative Rainbow Alliance, and we'll show the bios here. First, we have Rami El-Gharib. It's a particular pleasure to introduce Rami as someone of fellow Lebanese ancestry. Rami's life story includes one of persecution in both of our home countries of Lebanon and coming to the US. Rami has been very involved in creating safe spaces for the LGBTQ plus communities, both in Lebanon and now in the United States. He established a youth safe space in rural Colorado. He also has been involved as the program manager at the Georgia Justice Project. Next, I'd like to introduce to you Ames Stenson. Ames, who hails from Colorado, I had the pleasure of meeting during the NACRJ conference in Denver, being hosted by Ames in turn. So Ames comes to this work from a criminal justice, theology, and social work background. Was a program manager with the city of Englewood, Colorado, the municipal court RJ program there. Has been involved in the Colorado Coalition for Restorative Justice Practices as president, and worked with NACRJ's online programs. And they just finished a 7-year teaching stint as adjunct faculty at the University of Denver's Graduate School of Social Work. And then lastly, but not leastly, a pleasure to introduce Laura Beth Waltz. Laura, also from, excuse me, also from Colorado. It's an unfortunate time to lose my voice. Also from Colorado. Graduated from Lewis College, the University of Denver, focusing on media, gender theory, and theology. And currently teaching high school and college level philosophy, sociology, religion, and English courses. Laura Beth offers the school angle to restorative justice, particularly passionate about disrupting the school to prison pipeline. And with that, and without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to our beautiful guests for today. I want to remind you that you have the opportunity to put any comments or questions for our guests in the particular mode that your platform allows. We will be taking some time, almost like halfway through the presentation, to address any ones that seem relevant to that period of time, and then we'll have time at the end again to look at those and respond to any comments and questions that you might post. And with that, over to you.
Thanks, Tarek. Appreciate that. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're at in the country, in the world. My name is Ames. I use pronouns they, them, theirs. And if we could go to the next slide, that would be great. We're going to spend the first little bit of our slide just telling you about the Restorative Rainbow Alliance. And then we'll talk a bit more about our facilitator code that we recently put together. So we just wanted to highlight the folks that are on our board currently. We've had really amazing opportunity over the last 2 years to work together around building this facilitator code, but also addressing what the needs are of our community, of the queer community within restorative justice, restorative practices. So really want to honor Danielle and Michael, who are not able to be with us here today, but want to honor them as participants and huge contributors to our work. Next slide, please. So yeah, I don't know if maybe we all just want to say a little bit more about what we do in our day-to-day, but we all do have, day jobs. So I currently work in the city of Englewood, which is just south of Denver, as the program manager for our municipal court restorative justice program. Our community came together a few years ago and said, how do we bring this practice to our community? And so we've worked together to build a program for youth and adults, pre-arraignment for cases that would rather, instead of going through the municipal court, will come through our restorative justice program. So I'm really proud to be a part of that community in the work that we're doing there. Rami, can I pass to you?
Yeah, sure. My name is Rami Al-Gharib. As mentioned, I use he, him pronouns. I am the Restorative Justice Program Manager at the Georgia Justice Project. We've started a restorative justice program that takes on cases of adult violence or cases of felonies. So we do RJ, and we work with district attorneys to hopefully get those dismissed. And LB, I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Laura Beth, or LB is like the affectionate nickname. I work at a high school in Colorado Springs, Colorado, and my passion is training our youth facilitators. We do a ton of restorative work in our discipline process where at the school where I'm working, but the real highlight is bringing some of the young people into the theoretical framework and the work of restorative justice. We have about 23 trained facilitators at the high school where I work that do the facilitations, not only circles to do classroom resets, but peer-to-peer conflict. And it's been a real joy of my life to watch them grow into that as well. So excited to bring the school angle and talk to y'all about this work. Sorry, can we go to the next slide? Awesome. So one of the things that we just wanted to put up here is our vision and our mission. Mainly just because the vision that we have is pretty simple. We just want to have a more inclusive and affirming community for restorative justice practices and for practitioners. Our mission is to promote the inclusion, to increase the number of queer practitioners who may choose to jump into this field. We are passionate about the queer affirming circles, facilitator training, community outreach, and just continuing to assist in some of the research-based advocacy and creating more resources.
Just to jump into the vision angle. So we are big believers in queer liberation, and that is our ultimate goal. We believe that we can do that through restorative justice and restorative practices. And that's what we really are working for through our restorative justice and through restorative practice work, is being seen, being visible, and being represented.
Absolutely. Thank you. Next slide, please. So I'll just want to give you a little bit of information about the values that we're working from. So those of us that are in the Colorado area are familiar with what we call the 5 R's of restorative justice, restorative practices that Dr. Beverly Title put together, as you see here on the right of the screen. So the emphasis of relationships, respect, responsibility, repair, and reintegration throughout any practice or process that we're engaging in or how we engage together. And as Rami and LB were both just saying, that in addition to those concepts and values, we really are based in the concepts around affirmation of our LGBTIQA2S+ community, and who and how we are and what we bring to this world. We're really engaged. We're really committed to empowerment, visibility, inclusion, the anti-racist and anti-oppressive practices. We're really looking at the intersectionalities of these challenges as it relates to our queer community, and ultimately wanting to help perpetuate healing and transformation and leadership opportunities within our community. I also just want to name that as we go into, and if you're looking up on our website, we go more into our the acronym and why we chose to use LGBTIQA2S+ in the information that we share out and in our code. So there's more information in our code and in our website about why we choose to use that acronym. Next slide.
So let's talk about the creation of the Restorative Rainbow Alliance. A bit of background information. So as Tarek mentioned, I am from Lebanon, moved to the United States in 2018. For those of you who are not familiar with Lebanon and LGBTQ rights in Lebanon, it is illegal to identify as part of the LGBTQ+ community back in my home country. So a lot of people in our community serve prison time and jail time, 3 months to a year for just being out. So I grew up in that environment, also environment that is very homophobic and transphobic, worked with a lot of our community, and there was always a sense of wanting a safe space and coming together. And that really took me to the place of wanting to include LGBTQ plus work in anything that I do. And so anyways, moved to Colorado and was working with this nonprofit and was talking to a volunteer to get to know more about what was done before. And this volunteer said to me, there was the restorative justice coordinator before you got this case where a LGBTQ plus youth was being bullied for an entire year and then retaliated by punching the person that had been bullying them. And we brought them into restorative justice and had the LGBTQ plus youth in the seat of the responsible party, which I thought was really absurd because, and then this youth had to repair the harm to the other person who was bullying them and being homophobic to them for a year. What are we telling LGBTQ plus youth when we do that in restorative justice? We're telling them that homophobia and transphobia don't matter, that it doesn't cause harm, that physical harm is the only kind of harm that matters. So, and then we're having them repair harm to others who have been oppressive to them, which is really even more harmful. So maybe we shouldn't even be doing restorative justice if this is how we're going to be working with our community. So that really set me on this path of, well, what resources do we have? Is there a community that does LGBTQ plus focused work in this field? And I didn't find anything. And so there was a convening that happened with the Colorado Coalition for Restorative Justice Practices and the state of Colorado's Restorative Justice Council. They did that in November. And it was like a format of a Zoom room where you could type in what topics you wanted to discuss. So I did type in, LGBTQ plus needs in the field. And that's how Ames and Laura Beth and a few others joined. And we saw that it wasn't just this one thing. There were many things that were happening where circle keepers were misgendering a lot of participants. It was a lot more harm being done. And we just saw that this was just really a need where we really have to serve our community by highlighting this need. And that's how we came together as the Restorative Rainbow Alliance.
Yeah, awesome. Something that was important for us to consider was the historical context for restorative work when it comes to the queer community. We talked kind of in our values about the anti-racist work, and that's a piece of this too. We wanted to acknowledge how intersectional the work of queer liberation has been so far, and how many, people of color were the leaders of our historical movements. And that while there's a great deal of hope right now for many people, we have steps forward with, certain legislation. We also acknowledge that the current context is that we are still very much like in an embattled kind of gridlock with this work. Some of the data that we wanted to highlight, especially close to me, was this statistic about youth. 40% of homeless youth identifying as members of this community. 56% of students who are members of the LGBTQ community talk about engaging in self-harm, directly correlated to homophobic language. So while it feels like we're moving forward, there's also quite a bit of current context that makes this work really imperative. And especially in our restorative work, I think many of the queer leaders, the most successful, while we've obviously seen plenty of passive and nonviolent resistance, there's a lot of people within this community who felt that retaliation or the idea of bashing back or fighting back physically was one of the only ways toward liberation. It was really a goal of ours to consider if being restorative is our way of life and this is part of our identity. Is there a way to incorporate those two and figure out how we can find some peace, some justice, some advancement in a way that is restorative and maybe even transformative and healing as well? We could go to the next slide.
So thanks, LB, for mentioning some of the recent legislation. So as we've seen, we have had some victories. In 2009, there was the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act. So up until 2009, homophobia and transphobia was not federally considered as a hate crime. 2015, we got the right to get married federally, same-sex marriage victory. In 2022, a few months ago, is when we were federally protected. Our marriage is federally protected. So while we do have these victories, these are all very recent. These aren't victories that happened 40 years ago. We still have a long way to go. And unfortunately, 2022 also saw 306 anti-LGBTQIA2S plus bills introduced into state legislative sessions, which I think is the largest in many, many years. So while we're making advancements, we also have a long way of going, and we still have to counter some of those.
Yeah, thanks, Rami. And just to add that the 306 anti-LGBTIQA2S plus bills, we have that 86, data shows that 86% of those are really targeted towards trans youth. And so, again, we want to just highlight some of these points of data. There's a lot out there, but this isn't just historical challenges, right? These are current, everyday issues that are happening, which helps to create a sense of why is this important as restorative justice and restorative practitioners. Why do we need to be aware of these things? Why do we need to be mindful of this trauma that's not only historic, but current day, that is happening right now within our communities and towards our community? So again, just noting that the amount of people who've been murdered who identify as trans or non-binary, right? Knowing that when queer kids in school are bullied, they're twice as likely, that LGBTQ plus kids are twice as likely to experience bullying. And we know from the Human Rights Campaign that clearly that public opinion about trans and non-gender conforming folks directly influences the rates of violence that's enacted towards our community. And so these aren't just things that are out there that, these are things that are happening on a day-to-day basis that we need to be mindful of and aware of as we're engaging in these processes around healing, around how do we work together to be heard, to be seen, to create belonging. Next slide, please.
And so speaking directly to that violence, obviously this has been quite an intense time when we think about violence against our community, maybe more acutely so in Colorado Springs specifically. I mentioned that I'm a teacher and dean at a school in Colorado Springs, and Club Q was something that was an acute reminder of the current context, being that if we aren't able to halt some of this language or some of this bullying, some of these things on the front end, it can lead to extreme violence. We know that the language plays into overt physical violence, and this was a moment where our community experienced that. And as much as I am just devastated, it did feel so critical that RRA already existed, because we were able to respond to Club Q in a way that did feel somewhat restorative and healing, and at least provide space for folks to process. So our response, we've been working with another organization, Raw Tools, some of y'all might be connected to them as well, to hold processing events where people just have safe spaces to process their grief, share their experience. We've also been hosting these virtually. but really kind of circling up and taking the time to tell each other our stories. And we've seen an incredible response. One of the responses that I personally feel the most kind of in hope, like it created a lot of hope within me, was after we hosted a youth processing circle, since most of the events were happening at places where you were required to be 21 plus. We hosted an 18 and up processing circle, and many parents of queer children came to the event just to connect with us and ask, was there a space where they could process this so that they could be helpful in supporting their children as they process this? And so we held an additional circle for families and caretakers that were supporting queer youth. And that felt really powerful to be able to hold that space. One of the pictures here is an organization, K9 to 5, that showed up to sit outside the listening circle and just provide emotional support animals. So if people wanted to step out, or if the conversation got too heavy, they could step out and have an emotional support animal. So we've seen all the great things about the community and how our community has shown up, but we also were reminded about how critical this work is in this moment.
For those who are not familiar with what happened in Club Q, this was a mass shooting that happened at a gay bar, a gay space, and a lot of people, it was in Colorado Springs, and a lot of people from the Colorado Springs community felt like our spaces were under attack because gay bars and gay clubs have been a safe haven for LGBTQ plus folks when other places have not been. So thanks to Laura Beth and others and Raw Tools and so many others, we've been hearing that through these circles, we've been able to reclaim another space and be able to come together. Next slide, please. So before we dive into our code, if you want to grab your phone and just scan a QR code, we as a Restorative Rainbow Alliance did write a code for facilitators, circle keepers, whoever wants to read it, to elevate an LGBTQ plus lens in this field and to support folks in being able to support our community better. So if you want to grab your phone and scan the code, or if you want to go to our website, restorativerainbowalliance.org, and our code is on the website. Okay, next slide, please. So as mentioned, our code is something that we wrote. It includes an introduction and honoring, the historical and current context that we have talked about, that gives context to why we're doing this work, a bit about our alliance, purpose and use of the code. We give definitions for, LGBTIQA2S+, what those mean. So we start with really the basics to support folks. And then we dive deeper into the code and different standards that we've included. And then we have glossary and a resource for continued education where people can go to links and stay updated on LGBTQ plus happenings.
I think something that might be helpful too, just for folks to understand, is that we did model this code off of some of the state codes of conduct, off of the Colorado one specifically. So it's not an expectation that everyone just immediately becomes an expert. This is just a resource for if you find yourself going into a facilitation. Here is a resource that you can use to just gain a little bit more insight, and also consistently refer back to. We do post updated if we make any edits. We do immediately update those on the online version, which your QR code should always pull up.
Yeah, thanks, LB. I was also just going to add that this is written, that the Colorado State Code was written 10 years ago, right? And so we looked at that as just kind of a structure to start from, but it's not meant to be prescriptive, as is our facilitator code is not meant to be prescriptive in the way of steps 1 through 10. Now here's what you do. It's really, here are the things that we need to be thinking about intentionally, and we need to be asking and ourselves and engaging in questions and conversations in the programs and the schools and the organizations that we're working in as we're engaging restorative practices. So these are structured in that way to help in conversation. And as LB mentioned, we're going to continue to really update and change and update the code as the needs are present and as we need to respond to the community needs, and how to continue to create and support this work in our field. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to just take a little bit of time here to talk with you and highlight a couple of the standards that we wanted to share with you. But let me just pause, and I think actually we were going to take a little bit of time for some questions before we got deeper into the code. Okay, so we'll pause if we need to. If there's other questions, feel free to add those into the chat in whichever platform you're viewing this on. We'd be happy to pause and talk a little bit more about RA and kind of coming together. But as we move forward, we'll go into a little bit more of some of our standards. And again, obviously you can see it in the document that we go into a lot more detail, but we just wanted to highlight a few things. So as we think about some of our general standards, and as practitioners, we wanted to mention and name that if in a process we or someone in a process is misgendering or misnaming someone, whoever that person might be, that we, if we're the ones doing that we take full responsibility for our actions and acknowledge that mistake and the impact, just as we do, and we ask others to do that within our sort of practices of some kind. When in response to an incident, we need to be able to model that and do that. And so, we do that in a way that I apologize, instead of using he, I'm going to use they, based on what they've shared right in our pre-meeting or pre-conference, or in the conversations we know that these are the pronouns that this person uses. So rather than making assumptions, or rather than noticing that we've made a mistake and just kind of glossing over it, we need to pause and create intentional space to say, I apologize, I misgendered you, or I used the wrong name, and then go into the correct name and be able to move forward in that process. So that's one easy, quote unquote, easy thing or simple thing that we can do to practice what we're preaching and to practice what we're doing and engaging with people around. That's incredibly important. Next slide, please.
And sorry, Ames, this was one of the main questions that we got in the very beginning, was what to do if there's an accidental misgendering. And so we really wanted to set the space for, we know how to handle this restoratively without it becoming a huge burden on anyone. The idea is just naming it, correcting, and being able to move forward in a way that doesn't continue to bring attention. And it's not something that people should feel like this really deep, intense, need to apologize. Like, we just want people to know that most folks, as long as the acknowledgement is made, they're able to move forward. So that one was important because in the beginning of the coalition, that was a very, very common question.
Yeah, you don't want to apologize and apologize and apologize where the other person is now comforting you and telling you, oh, so I'm sorry for making you feel bad for calling you out on your misgendering me. So acknowledge it, apologize and move forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And so again, going back to something that even Tarek had mentioned at the beginning, right? Restorative practices is about, in part, how do we create this sense of belonging? We're not separate. We're all a part of the whole. And so in order to do that, we really need to honor each other in our full humanness. And so, using appropriate pronouns, using appropriate, accurate names and pronouns, it's honoring that person as a full person and who and how they want to present themselves and who they are. And so this is as an example, right, of if we believe that in our practice of how do we show up and create inclusion and belonging, these are some examples of how we might do that in our processes. So starting every circle with, here's my name and here's my pronouns. And giving that as an option, right? That's the other thing, is we're not forcing it down people's throats. Restorative practices is about being voluntary. So we're inviting people into that, normalizing so that we're not assuming based on looks, oh, this must be the pronoun this person uses. It's actually saying, here's my name, here's my pronouns, inviting people to participate in that. And so that's one way of being inclusive. Another way is looking at our paperwork and our forms that we have. Oftentimes, many of us use forms that have to include a legal name. So if that's the case, also including some kind of line that says, well, what is the name that you go by, right? Or if you, as part of your program, have to collect gender information, rather than just having the binary of male, female, or prefer not to answer, are there opportunities to create a more inclusive options that you want to name? So here's some potential ideas as you see of, maybe people kind of fill in what they feel like is more appropriate as far as their gender. Maybe it doesn't fit here, so maybe it's pangender, or maybe it's genderqueer, right? So giving people the opportunity to fill that in is an incredibly empowering practice. And again, we're practicing power with people in these practices. So how do we empower people to use the language that best describes who they are, who we are, each of us, right? And so we can look at what are the titles that we offer as suggestions. What is the name that we're offering? So again, these are pretty simple things, but maybe things that we haven't thought about as practitioners. And so again, as you read through the code, invite you to do that, you'll kind of hopefully pick up on some of these tips that are going to be really helpful, and just some basic pieces to make the practice in your program more inclusive.
Yeah, something I wanted to add too is we've seen in schools folks always starting and really like forcing the, please share your name and pronoun. And while that's a wonderful thing to model as an ally, even just small things like considering how that might force someone who's brand new to a space to have to out themselves as using they, them pronouns when they're not quite ready. So again, Ames mentioned, the not forcing, and how that's part of restorative work is to invite and create the space. But just that reminder of, even when we think we're doing something that is sort of best practice with inclusivity, is this something that we could always continue to think about and center that desire to hold space and come into community together.
Next slide, please.
Something else to consider, and this can be challenging in this work often, is the respect for privacy. And this standard specifically kind of focuses on like really being considerate about the physical space and how you can create some privacy or some safety in the physical space. Obviously, when asking for someone's preferred name and pronouns, a second step of that is this a name, and are these pronouns that I can use around others? Checking is this the name and pronoun you want to use throughout this conversation? Just so you know that you are allowing them to opt in to when and how those their name and pronouns are used. Other things to consider when choosing a physical space: just, are there bathrooms that everybody can use throughout the facilitation? Is there, are we doing this in a space where this conversation may require more privacy, but others that might be detrimental could overhear? And something that we often talk about too is really being thoughtful about creating a welcoming space, especially if you are hosting in a space that might have kind of a history of contentious views for queer folks. not saying that those aren't the spaces that we can use, just being especially mindful about inclusion and inclusive symbols potentially if you are facilitating in a space like that.
I just want to add too that, you know, we also know that sometimes restorative justice processes or practices are happening within spaces that, you know, there isn't, like, let's say, an all-inclusive restroom. And so if that's the case, we're not saying, well, now spend however much money and build out a new bathroom, although if you can, great. But it's really more about the acknowledgement of, okay, this isn't actually present here. However, here's another option, or here's how the layout is, right? And so it's really about the acknowledgement and about the process of the communication, so that there's a recognition of the intentionality behind it versus, oh, we can't have a restorative justice conference here because it only has male-female restrooms. It's really more about the conversation. Just want to add that part.
Next slide, please. So something else we discuss is participation, name and addressing harm. So defining harm, facilitators really need to recognize the trauma and the oppression that LGBTQ plus folks go through and have been through. So we talk a lot about being trauma-informed in our field. That is really important to keep in mind because, I mean, I would say most, if not all, LGBTQ plus folks have been through some form of trauma, some form of oppression, and that can come up in different ways. A slight joke or word that people may not think is a big deal may create a reaction because we are continuously still being oppressed, and a lot of things add up. So coming from a space of, why is this person reacting this way instead of what's wrong with this person? Because there are so many layers to that harm, to homophobia and transphobia. Things add up, and we need to really understand that this person is going through a lot. So be mindful of that. I mean, as mentioned, trauma, you know, is big in our community. I mean, coming out is a trauma. No matter how your family, support system, guardians react to it, the recognition that you are different than everyone else and that in some ways society is hostile towards you is a trauma itself. So please keep in mind all of those in general, whether you know or not that you're working with queer folks, because you may not know that you're working with someone from our community. Next slide, please. Sorry, go ahead, Elby.
Go ahead. So something else we wanted to talk about was the ability for facilitators to feel some comfort in naming harm, whether that is naming, like Rami was just talking about, hey, the first action that led to this was this homophobic language. So can that be something that we mediate, as well as, we're not saying that you are letting people off the hook for retaliatory action. We're just saying, can we name and hold space for the initial harm as well? Something that our community is pretty familiar with is these different methods of kind of blame shifting tactics. So we go through these in the code like pretty in depth. So if you want more information, you know, we kind of like give you a glossary where here's how these have been used historically, and here's certain spaces or environments where you might see these be more triggering. For example, the like gay panic defense we talk about, and that one I would say is probably going to be a little bit, it's hurtful in many spaces, but in a space where kids grew up hearing about Matthew Shepard and the like sitting through the court proceedings, hearing about gay panic as the defense, like Rami mentioned, that can trigger some trauma in just that memory. So just understanding that there are blame shifting tactics that have been used against queer folks, whether that is gay panic, whether that is kind of the desire to shift the focus if there are rumors about sexuality. The Twinkie defense is what some folks call the diminished capacity. So the diminished capacity blame shifting tactic, just as a facilitator, having some familiarity with those can really inform your work as you're facilitating with someone who this may feel really acute in their bodies and in their experience.
So we also talk about creating an inclusive space and setting an inclusive tone. So as mentioned previously by Ames and Laura Beth, is that when we want to do a restorative justice conference, dialogue, want to have just a pre-conference or preparation meeting with someone, make sure the space is inclusive. I know a lot of people think of places of worship as the places of ultimate forgiveness and welcoming spaces. That hasn't always been true for our community. Places of worship have been historically hostile towards us. So maybe if you know it or not, if you have someone from the queer community coming into a place of worship, having just symbols that are affirming to someone from our community, because you may not see this as a place that's hostile towards you, but they may see it as a place that is hostile towards them if they want to share their sexuality and come out or their identity. So if you do have to hold facilitations in these spaces, just add some symbols if you can. That really goes a long way.
And like Ames mentioned, just naming things sometimes goes a long way. Just naming in the pre-conference, what's your comfort level? And I do acknowledge that this could potentially be something that you're considering. Just that really open naming can go a long way as well.
Right. So as you see, we're kind of jumping a little bit back between the different standards, but really, again, wanted to highlight a couple from each of them to give you an example. And so when we talk about this idea of invested facilitation, we're really going back to that idea of we need to be incredibly self-aware as we're practicing as facilitators, anytime we're a part of a restorative justice, restorative practice process. And so one, noticing, are there things that are coming up in me that are happening that might be stirring up my own biases, right? Am I operating from maybe an unconscious bias that would then become conscious in that moment? Or are there mechanisms within programs so that we can support one another in giving feedback and saying, actually, this was challenging in this situation. So being aware and then having people and practitioners that we can connect with to dialogue and to learn and continue to grow. And again, going back to something that we talked about before, if there is something that is mentioned in a process, we need, as a microaggression, we need to make sure that is stopped while it's occurring. So again, not just glossing over it and coming back to it later, but let's say someone uses, we've heard situations where someone uses the pronoun it versus the pronoun they. And so in that moment saying, we're not going to use that language. We've agreed to our ground rules and our norms together. We need to get back to using those. So how do we do that together? Or let's do that together, right? And so, or if someone uses, some kind of slur word or something to that effect, again, in our minds as practitioners, we need to be listening for, is this something that that could potentially kind of impact someone in a way that's not ultimately creating that inclusive space of belonging, and in fact is creating more harm. And so that's why it's really important that any kind of homophobic or biphobic, transphobic language that is used needs to be stopped in the moment. And then this is really paired well with our 7 standards of that continued education. So best practices, best practices around facilitation, but also around how do we create LGBTQ plus inclusion. RRA, as an organization, we're working towards eventually writing a best practices document that could be paired with the code that we've created. But also knowing your community, knowing your state, knowing what's happening in your area around maybe laws or policies or barriers that are either inclusive or exclusive and hurtful and harmful. And so we're not asking folks to now be, complete, professionals or experts in knowing all the things that LGBTQ plus folks face, but we need to be mindful. We need to stay educated so that we can respond. We can be listening in a different way that then helps create that more inclusive place.
I would also just like to add, if there is still any homophobic, biphobic, transphobic, or any oppressive language that is happening before you even take someone to a restorative conference or circle, that's a non-starter. Like, don't take someone to this space so they can share that hatred with someone else and cause more harm. Because we talk about creating supportive communities and reducing harm, so it's important to be aware of, can this cause a lot more harm? How can I stop it before it even begins?
Yeah.
And on that note, just like Ames was talking about, knowledge about laws, policies, what's happening, something that is true in that staying educated element is responsive to the culture and the community, knowing kind of what things are happening culturally, whether that's, I mentioned that you may notice something feeling more acute in a space that's like Laramie, Wyoming, where there is a history of this hate crime existing. Really knowing if you're able to, or trying to educate yourself on those cultural elements too that have informed the history of the community, the LGBTIQA2S plus community in your physical space, in your state, in your area, in maybe if you're working in a school, within like the history of that school, just so that you can go in able to be an invested facilitator where you kind of know all the parameters that someone may be experiencing.
Next slide, please.
Okay, so we're opening it up for questions, so we can respond and then have a conversation about this. In the meantime, maybe we can go to the next slide so we can share what our next moves are as an alliance. So we plan on working on a best practices document, as mentioned before. So we already have a code. This will really be able to support the code. We're developing trainings, and we can train folks. So if you would like to be trained in your organization to do this work, please contact us on our email, restorative_rainbow_alliance that's restorative_rainbow_alliance@gmail.com. Also, we do speaking engagements, so feel free to go on our website and contact us through there. And if you are someone from the community, if you identify as queer, if you identify as LGBTQIA2S+, and you are doing this work, we would love to connect with you. So please feel free to reach out to us and connect with us. We'd love to find ways to support anyone doing this work and collaborate. Also, just to mention, we have consulted with organizations, so anywhere from the district attorney's office, we have done that, to schools and different restorative justice programs.
Yeah, especially if you find your community needing some solid facilitation around this, like please reach out to us, and we can train or consult with you on what would be the best. I think we're trying to, there we go, add everyone back in so we can do questions as well. So feel free to drop the questions in.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for the presentation. There are a variety of links that were shared as well. If you want to go to the Restorative Rainbow Alliance.org website as well, there you can check out the code of conduct that we've just been talking about. So there are a few questions that I see here. The first one is, well, there's one about how can we get more information. Hopefully that's been answered too. If there, Stephanie, if there's a specific information that you're looking for, maybe let us know and we'll go back to that. But the second question that was posed is, I have a student that actually asked to use it. How common is that? And I'm wondering if that's in reference, do you know, LB? Yeah, okay.
In reference to the comment of it being a microaggression. Yeah, I think that if that's the pronoun that your student specifically feels like appropriate and finds peace with, that's one thing. Obviously, like, I think that's fine if that's what the student is choosing, and that wouldn't be a microaggression if the person has specifically asked for that. More of the microaggression is sometimes when that is used for someone who prefers they them pronouns, or maybe even someone who was has transitioned and they use she her pronouns, but someone is saying it as a microaggression to point out that they're different. Or often I think where it becomes harmful is if people are using it to be dehumanizing. That's when it's really a microaggression that has to be halted. But if the student prefers that, even if it's, you may like express at some point, like, yeah, to other students, I feel some discomfort because of dehumanizing aspects as well, but this is how the student chooses to identify, and so we want to respect that.
Also, sorry, just want to jump in and mention our email is restorativerainbowalliance@gmail.com, and our Instagram is restorative_rainbow_alliance.
All right, let's move on to the next question. Are there particular school districts or schools in Colorado that are a model for this type of work? And if you happen to know of any schools or school districts outside of Colorado as well, I'm sure we might have others interested in that.
I mean, I think we see a lot of schools trying their best to create LGBTQ+ inclusive spaces for youth. In terms of adding the inclusivity part that we do, I think we're filling this gap, and we've spoken to some schools. I know Laura Beth's school does some of that. Laura Beth, if you want to share more.
Yeah, I don't know. There's definitely model schools. Often the model schools are going to be like kind of on the back of like one or two people's work. Like I would say that some of the work in our area specifically, Jeffco as a school district was one that was kind of on the front end of SEL and restorative justice work, inclusion work. Often they'll be kind of like the district level that's an exemplar because they have good policy and they're like really promoting this. They're training folks. So D11 trains folks. I would say that we have a very like invested school district in this work. And the like Palmer High School, we've trained quite a few different schools in the district on how to bring kids into this and get your kids trained so that they can be facilitating and helping with some of that work. So I'd be happy to connect. But again, there's also just schools that are doing a lot of this work because of a few really invested people within their school community. For example, Whitefield, their there are quite a few people that are kind of holding that up and getting educated in this work and continuing to do it within their own offices or in their own classrooms. I know that their principal is really invested in this work and doing a lot of this work independently. But if whoever asked that question, if you'd like to connect, I would love to connect. I'd love to connect you with our district facilitator and then some of our school level folks as well.
Thank you. So that was Sierra Bitsy. Sierra, you're encouraged to be in touch with LB. Maybe before we take this next question, I want to ask a question in there, which is to provide perhaps the brief explanation for the expanded acronym.
Sure. I mean, the brief explanation is that so many times folks are silenced for their identities, right? And so we really wanted to call attention to, rather than just LGBT plus, LGBTQ plus, we wanted to integrate intersex, we wanted to integrate asexual, and 2S represents two-spirit, which is often used in different Native American communities for folks who are third gender or however, gender expansive. And so because we wanted to be inclusive and we're really trying to highlight how to include folks and be visible, we wanted to use that lengthened acronym.
All right, thank you for that.
I would also add Michael Tom, one of our other founding members, is a member of the Dene Nation. And so that was a really essential part that he helped us to understand the elevation of like the 2S plus, especially if we're doing this work within Colorado and within areas that is so heavily important to remember kind of first harm and the fact that we're on Indigenous land. So that honoring as well.
Great. So with that in mind, I'll go to the question, which is how has RRA been a way to strengthen and grow the LGBTIQA2S plus RJ practitioner community?
So we've been in contact and reaching out to different LGBTQ plus organizations that aren't RJ, specific in different states, to try to connect, to try to see how we can work with their community centers and creating like circle spaces, so that way we can start to encourage others to go into this field. So that's one way that we've done it, and that we've tried. We try as much as possible to talk about this code in our criminal justice setting work, as I do and Ames does, so that maybe others are interested, and this can be a way where others join in towards that vision of queer liberation, as I like to call it.
Yeah, and just to add that we've also, in our conversations with different folks, we presented at the National Association of Community Restorative Justice Conference this last summer, and had so many people come up to us afterwards or contact us to say, this is the one of the first times I've seen my identities as who I am as a queer person, and my desire and want to live the values and practices of restorative justice coming together. And so just through those connections and then the ongoing outreach that we're trying to make it, that so far kind of the feedback that we've gotten is that it feels inclusive to folks that are already doing this work, who maybe didn't feel like they could bring their full selves. And I'll include myself in that, my full self as a queer person, to this work.
Okay, thank you for that. And Ames, if I can keep it with you, we have a question here about an invitation to explain the use of your pronoun, they and them.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Thanks for the question. So I use pronouns they, them, theirs because I identify as non-binary or pangender. And so I consider myself to be gender, not outside of the binary, right? And so for me, it doesn't fit. It's not accurate for me to say I use she, her, or he, him. I use it as an all-inclusive. I'm kind of a part of the gender expansive I am gender expansive in who I am. And so that, use of they, them is really about accuracy. It's not even really in my mind about preference. It's about what's accurate. So oftentimes some people I know, use she, they, or, whatever that might be. And so in the bottom line with pronouns is you always want to ask, you never want to assume, right? But for me, using they, them pronouns is about accuracy. So rather than making an assumption based on how I look or my voice or whatever, it's really about how am I seen? And this is the way that feels most accurate for me of asking folks to use the they, them pronoun.
Thanks for that. And then Rachel Larson has another question. Do you have any educational plans, activities, or other ways to incorporate the Facilitator Code of Conduct into a program's facilitator training?
That's a good question. I personally included in my facilitator training, my program's facilitator training, as part of that intersectionality of being anti-racist and anti-oppressive. And so, there's a lot of intersectionality in there. So I use our code to help people, have that queer lens and be aware of it. In terms of specific activities, maybe that's something I need to think about.
Yeah, I was going to say not yet, but love where you're going with this, Rachel, and would love to talk more with you about that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, one thing that we often will do with the kids is just, so I'm talking about training high school age students to facilitate. That will often require like a lot more of that hands-on, like walk them through it and model. And so sometimes I will use it in that where I'm talking about, okay, so you've started to think about the pre-conference, you've done kind of the initial review of this. What are the top 15 things we need to consider when we're talking about, we definitely need to hit this in the pre-conference, or we definitely need to consider this when choosing space. So I do it a lot more breaking down what I think when you've been a facilitator for a while feels like second. It's like not a process that's actively happening in your head because you're a trained facilitator and you've been doing it for so long. So breaking it down to that kind of lower level of how did you get there, where you pause and consider and really pre-plan what questions are you going to ask. When I'm training the younger folks, that really helps them with some of that. And I'll bring in some of the elements, not just of our code, but also, what else in our community do we need to be responsive to and think about with the identities that have been disclosed so far.
All right. There's also some appreciations that have come across the comments. So make sure to recognize that. I have one activity I'll just mention real quickly that might fit in well. Imagine that you give participants, perhaps as individuals or in groups, kind of backgrounds on who they are, and they may be a particular participant who has particular life experiences. So let's say they're queer, identify as queer. Let's say they've experienced a variety of name calling through school or something like that. So each person has their own kind of, are sitting with that life experience and identity, and then you sort of flash on the screen a statement that might seem innocuous if you don't have that life experience and identity, but then if you do, it's not. It carries certain meaning, and so you like flash it across, and you ask, so is there anyone for whom this raises anything? And then you'll see different groups will say, well, for me, that really brought up this experience that I've had. It's actually really hard to hear. And other groups who weren't primed for that will be surprised to know, wow, okay, just that word or that pronoun or something like that can have such an effect. I wonder, in the code, I'm going to ask a question here myself. In the code, it talks about disrupting homophobic or transphobic language when it's happening. Rami, you also emphasized that. Do you have any ideas on how to do that when you're in the setting of a conference where you're trying to hold people in a sense of connection, and help everyone there be themselves and fully recognized? Do you have any tips on how to have that happen in a way that doesn't have people shut down, withdraw, or question your facilitator, partiality? Yeah.
I think that's a great question. I mentioned that a lot of, stopping that harm before it happens, or if it happens, just saying, this language is not welcome in this space, because this language sticks with us. If we're called slurs or misgendered, some may think, let it pass. But for myself, at least, I know that when I have faced these kinds of harms, I remember them after years or after time. So my preferred way is just to say this language is not welcome in this space. I mean, I understand how maybe that can create a, are you now impartial or not? I would like to shift from being impartial to being, invested in keeping those relationships and in preventing harm at the same time. So if someone believes that shutting down homophobia is impartial, then, I mean, they would know that they are saying something that's harmful. So it's not like they're going to be surprised that it's being shut down. Yeah, Ames and LB, any suggestions? I know mine was a bit more combative, maybe.
No, thanks, Rami. I would just add, so one of the things I've done before is someone was using an incorrect pronoun for a participant. And so what I did is just said, I've heard this person ask us to use this pronoun. And so I'd like to remind us that that's the pronoun that we need to use. And that helped kind of shift it back into, okay, we need to get back to the norms, right? We need to get back to what is it that we're here to do. And as we know, with any challenge that comes up in a process or conference, if we need to pause and take a break and check back in with folks, check in how they're doing, what do you need, talk with the person that continues to perpetuate the harmful language, then we do that. And so as facilitators, that's again why we need to be empowered to take, to create that pause if we need to help come back to the norms and really create that inclusive space of belonging. That's a responsibility that we have, as we know, as facilitators. So those are some ways that I've done that in the past.
Also, a lot of the homophobic language, especially with youth who they might not understand what, like the impact or what it is they're saying sometimes, really doing a lot of those like processing conversations around that language in the pre-conference so that you're not having to do that education in front of the other person. Really, that tends to help. And assuring them that anything that felt close or personal to them, you would also like hold the boundary on. So sometimes I'll have kids, say, well, why can't I say this, but so-and-so could say this? And really like that reassuring of if I were hearing that, I would pause and do the exact same thing because this language matters. And just that ultimate reassurance that you're willing to hold kind of the boundary of inclusivity for everyone.
All right, thank you for that. I think my recommendation for any practitioners out there and trainers out there is to actually role play and try to make it seem real and role play and then discuss how it goes. So I have one more question. I kind of want to zoom out a little bit to something that might be a little more structural. Rami, you described coming from a country where this is illegal. And then we've also heard how anti-trans and other legislation are on the rise. So my question is, what do we do about that? And how to be an ally, particularly both for the domestic developments, but also internationally in the many countries where there's even less freedom for LGBTQIA2S plus folks.
Sure. I would say some of my recommendations would just be to really always try to think of our community in every setting. I mean, I know a lot of folks who say to me, you know, we're allies, we go to Pride Parade, and then we're invisible for the rest of the year. So try to always look for resources, for organizations around, see if you can give your time, if not your time, other kinds of resources. Research what's happening in other countries as well of LGBTQ plus persecution, and bring that to everyone's knowledge here, because it's so important for us as a community to stick together wherever we are in this world. So I guess research, providing resources, reaching out, trying to create spaces for others to process. If you're not part of the community, maybe create a group of folks who have queer kids who are parents who want to be able to process and create ways of moving forward with some activism. So those are my suggestions.
I also think leaning into the work of restorative practices, some of the most powerful moments that I've seen where people really came to an understanding was sitting in circle and hearing Rami's story or hearing stories from other students. That element really made folks start to think, because it was so deeply personalized and contextualized for them, based on somebody that they were sharing that circle space with and feeling really connected to. But one of our facilitator guidelines is trying to incorporate these practices no matter who's in the room, no matter if you don't shift everything just because you think potentially maybe this person that you're going to facilitate with is a member of the queer community, but rather like holding that space with or without those folks in the room, I think is a really important action for an ally as well.
And then I would just add to that continued work of recognizing our own biases and doing our inner work of, wow, what's coming up for us, or what are the things that we're struggling with, and how do we work through that? And that saying of hurt people is shared a lot within their sort of justice restorative practitioner community. And the good news is that loving people also create loving and healing opportunities and transformation as well. And so the more we can tune into how do we acknowledge the things that are happening within us, it's not just about those people, right? It's about that internal work too of what are we doing for our own liberation and own love and compassion that then translates into how we engage in the world and our communities.
Wonderful. We've heard a lot of suggestions out there, from becoming more informed, certainly going to the code itself, reading that, incorporating that into your trainings, creating spaces in those circles to be able to discuss these things, and using self-reflection. So with that, we're going to ask you all, what is one action you can commit to in order to be more inclusive in your RJRP practice with LGBTIQA2S plus participants? And if you'd like to respond to that in the comments, we'd love to get a sense of what you're taking away. And as we see if there's any comments to that, we hope at the least that you'll just consider and they'll chew on that through the rest of this day. I want to take the opportunity to thank our guests, not just for being here, but for the work that you've invested into creating the code, into creating new language for the RJRP community, bringing things, elevating things to our awareness. I know I'm going to be walking away. I'd like to review the code with some of my colleagues in different programs we have. So I thank you for that. We do have, looks like one person has written to have inclusive intake forms and practices around gender and pronouns, like we saw in one of those slides. So I think there are both many different detailed ways to be more inclusive, and there's also the deeper kind of way of being more inclusive as well. Incorporate a recognition of the bathroom spaces when facilitating. That's another one we found on the chat there. So I think with that, I want to leave you all in the hands of Mary, who has some closing announcements. Thank you again for being with us, and we hope to see you next month.
Thank you, Tarek. I just want to say thank you again also to our guests for sharing your powerful work with us. Before we close, I have one announcement to make, which is just to visit our website and see what upcoming webinars there are. Thank you everyone for being here, and enjoy the rest of your day.